As the weather warms up, travelers are hitting the road after spending months inside due to COVID-19 restrictions.
Memorial Day is around the corner, and that's another big holiday that announces the advent of summer.
Akshay Rao is a professor with the University of Minnesota's Carlson School of Management. He says after a recent cybersecurity attack forced one of the largest gas and fuel pipelines in the U.S. to shut down Friday, drivers may notice increased gas prices in certain states.
You have a reduction in supply, and that immediately puts some pressure on prices that force prices upwards, even if the particular gas station is not affected.
Colonial Pipeline, which transports 45% of the East Coast's fuel supply, blamed the cyber attack on ransomware and said some of its information technology systems were affected.
Right now, there is not a supply shortage. We are preparing for multiple possible contingencies.
In light of the recent hack, the U.S. Department of Transportation announced they are issuing a temporary hours of service exemption for truckers transporting gasoline to affected states.
The Department of Transportation issued an emergency order to loosen restrictions on truck drivers in order to allow more fuel to be transported by a tanker.
Right.
In the meantime, Brown says drivers should continue to monitor changes in gas prices before hitting the road.
Suggestion to people is to not panic, because panic tends to feed on itself, and then you have an artificial scarcity that will naturally increase prices.
The FBI is working to prosecute those responsible. We know that the company is planning to restore that by the end of the week. Back to you.
Thank you, Charmaine.